Morning, everyone. Are we good to go? Yeah, good stuff. Hi, I'm Tricia Keelty. I'm Head of Social Justice and Policy with the Society of St Vincent de Paul, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning to the fourth event of the Children's Rights Alliance End Child Poverty Week. So far, we've seen great coverage of the issue of child poverty, which is really positive as we head closer to Budget 2024. And today we're going to be talking about the crucial issue of income and income adequacy. We've got a great panel of speakers here this morning who I'll introduce in a moment. But I suppose just to speak a little bit about the issue of income inadequacy, something that permeates throughout the work of SVP across the country. People going without essentials, constantly juggling due to lack of income. And I think we've really heard quite strongly throughout End Child Poverty Week the impact that has on children, young people and their parents, the constant stress of strain of not knowing where you're going to and how you're going to make ends meet. And I suppose we really need to consider what is the short and long-term impact of that. So as well as talking about how income inadequacy impacts different groups in Irish society today, we're very much focused on the solutions and how we can address it in a comprehensive way as well. So today we have an incredible lineup of speakers. We have Professor Hugh Fraser from the University of Maynooth. We have Seamus Boland from Irish Rural Link. We've Dervla McDonough from Inclusion Ireland, Louise Bayliss from Focus Ireland and Spark, and Paul Gordon from the National Youth Council, and also Sarah Sid from the Irish Refugee Council. So really we have a huge wealth of experience in the room today, and I hope we can have a really great discussion. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to hear from Hugh now, who'll set the context on the issue of income inadequacy, particularly from a European perspective, and then we'll have our panel discussion. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions and for audience involvement as well. So I'll now hand over to Hugh, who is adjunct professor at Maynooth University, former director of the Irish Combat Poverty Agency, and an expert on European Union social policy and child poverty. So it's fantastic to have him here to share his expertise. So over to you, Hugh. Thank you.
So it's great to be here, and thank you very much, Trish, for the introduction. It's always good to be back at Children's Rights Alliance events, and congratulations on an amazing week so far. And it's really sort of, I think, positive that there's a new political climate, I think, in relation to child poverty. And I think Children's Rights Alliance have been core to that through the persistence with which you've pursued issues of child poverty, both here in Ireland, but also I'm very conscious that you've contributed at European level, particularly as part of Eurochild. It's also great to be here in this space. I know we're talking about income adequacy, but I feel I'd have to mention I've always believed passionately access to cultural and creative activities for children is an important element in tackling poverty. So it's really great to be here and be holding an event in this magnificent building. In case you're going to be disappointed, I should warn you at the beginning, I'm not going to tell you what the changes need to be in the budget. I'm very conscious I've been working at European level. I'm not in touch in great detail on what's been happening at the Irish level. And the things I've read made me well aware it's been much better done by others. It's been done, of course, by the Children's Rights in the terms of the Child Poverty Monitor recently, the ongoing work of the Vincentian MESL Research Centre showing what an adequate income really is. The report last week by the ESRI on poverty, income inequality and living standards made some very constructive suggestions about what needs to happen in terms of income support. And I think that was very well reflected then by Fintan O'Toole in Tuesday's Irish Times, and I heard him speaking also at your event yesterday. And then I'm very conscious that we have a very well-informed panel who knows much better the needs and particular situations of different groups of children who are affected by poverty, and will be much better qualified than I am to say what needs to happen in the next budget. And I really look forward to listening to you all. So that's what I'm not going to talk about. What I am going to talk about is maybe try and just give a broad overview based on my experience of the last 2 decades working at European level on social poverty, and particularly on child poverty. I was very involved in all the feasibility studies that led to the child guarantee, but also in work before that. And I've been involved just recently. I have a book coming out with some colleagues, including Olivier de Schutter, who's the UN rapporteur on extreme poverty, on the escape from poverty. And we're looking at the intergenerational perpetuation of poverty and what you need to do about it. And a key part of that is about tackling child poverty. So I'll be drawing on that sort of experience. And anybody wants a rest this morning, I'll tell you the 6 points I'm going to make, so you don't have to listen to the detail then afterwards. So I'm going to say why it's a political obligation to have an adequate income for children, the negative consequences of inadequate income, how inadequate income limits access to essential services, why it's important to give special attention to children who are most at risk, why does no one policy fix, but there's a suite of policies that are necessary for an adequate income, and then finally just to stress that it's ensuring an adequate income is not a cost, it's an investment of the state. So, an international and EU obligation. I guess we start with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and particularly I think Article 27, which recognizes the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development, and stresses the responsibility of government to assist parents and others responsible for the child to implement this right, and it goes on in more detail. So essentially that's saying access to an adequate income is a right and is critical to ensuring the other rights set out in the convention. So ensuring an adequate income is not just a possible policy option for governments, it is an obligation of governments to do the best they possibly can to achieve it. I think also at UN level, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are relevant. They talk about reducing at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions, and to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures. That means implementing adequate social protection measures. And again, we are all signed up to delivering that, so governments should be delivering it. At EU level, I guess a key moment was the Lisbon Treaty of 2006, which came into force at the end of 2009. And in particular in that, there is the horizontal, or what's known as the horizontal social clause, which is Article 9, which in essence provides a basis for mainstreaming social protection and social inclusion issues across all EU and national policies. And it talks, amongst other things, about the guarantee of adequate social protection and the fight against social exclusion. And at the same time, the Lisbon Treaty introduced explicit objective to protect children's rights, and it gave the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union the same status as the treaties of the Union, and thus the duty to protect the rights of the child. So children shall have the right to such protection and care as is necessary for their well-being. So in essence, the EU, and by definition then the member states, are committed to ensuring that children have an adequate income. We then look at the Commission recommendation of 2013 on investing in children breaking the cycle of disadvantage. And this, in a sense, pulled together 10 years' work on child poverty in the EU. And it set out a three-pillar approach. And the first pillar was access to adequate resources as being essential. And it said that supporting parents' participation in the labour market should be one part of that, and providing for adequate living standards through a combination of benefits, and an adequate standard of living compatible with a life in dignity. And that was a Commission recommendation, but it was endorsed by the European Council, therefore by member states. So in effect, there was a commitment from every country, including Ireland, that it should then meet those standards. We then had the European Pillar of Social Rights in 2017 and Principle 11. And that says that children have the right to affordable early childhood education and care of good quality. Children have right to protection from poverty. And children from disadvantaged backgrounds have the right to specific measures to enhance equal opportunities. And clearly part of the implication of that is that children have the right to an adequate income. Then the other key European thing, which you will all know is more recent, is the European Child Guarantee. And this follows on very much from the Commission recommendation on investing in children and acknowledges that it's in the context of that. It, in a sense, concentrates on strand 2, which is access to services. But it also emphasizes the need for countries to have an enabling policy framework, a multidimensional policy framework, and stresses the critical role of policies supporting parents or guardians' access to a decent income, either through labour market integration or through income support. So again, an acknowledgement that income support is at the heart of tackling child poverty, and that was a council recommendation. So every government signed up to that and is committed to delivering it. So there is a commitment, an obligation to ensure that children and their families have access to an adequate income. Just on the negative consequences of inadequate income, and I guess you will all know this from your own experience, but I just wanted to summarize some of the learning from the international and European level. At the US, there was a US National Academies report in 2019, a roadmap to reducing child poverty. And it said, on average, a child growing up in a family whose income is below the poverty line experiences worse outcomes than a child from a wealthier family in virtually every dimension, from physical and mental health to educational attainment and labour market success, to risky behaviours and delinquency. And it summarised and trawled all the evidence available on this. So that's just a summary of their conclusion. Again, looking at what we found through the work we did on the European Child Guarantee and also work I've done more recently on the escape from poverty, several consequences of inadequate income emerge. Children experiencing poor physical and mental health, malnutrition and food poverty, living in inadequate housing and living in disadvantaged neighbourhoods, experiencing educational disadvantage, limited participation in recreational, social, cultural and sporting activities, more likely to experience discrimination and stigmatization, more likely to encounter violence, antisocial behavior and drug taking, at greater risk of social isolation and having limited social networks, and experiencing poverty-related stress and the undermining of their aspirations, self-confidence and hope for the future. Now, that's not to say that inadequate income is the only cause of that, but it's the key element in that, and it obviously varies significantly from country to country what the factors are. Then the other general point I would make about the negative consequences of inadequate income, and this is acknowledged actually in the various Commission recommendations, is that it leads to the intergenerational perpetuation of poverty. Children growing up in poverty are more likely to be poor as adults. In the US, children experiencing poverty at any point during childhood are 3 times as likely to be poor at the age of 30. They, in their turn, are more likely to have children who will be poor. So if we want to end poverty, we have to invest in tackling child poverty. Closely linked to the negative effects of inadequate income is the issue of inadequate income limits access to essential services. Clearly, and we've heard this at some of the other workshops during the week, is how important access to key services are for helping children's development and how some children have poor access. And one of the factors that limits that quite often is an inadequate income. And it is one of the key reasons that there was a European Child Guarantee, was to try and overcome this problem. Again, looking at the studies we did on inadequate income, it limits participation in ECEC in many countries. It limits effective and free access to school-based activities and extracurricular activities, things like back-to-school costs and participation in school activities. It's a factor in inadequate housing and experiencing energy poverty. It often can limit access to health services and getting prescribed medicines. It often reduces access to sporting, recreational, cultural activities. It causes food poverty and limits access to healthy nutrition. Also can be a factor in limited access to school meals. and it limits access to transport, especially essential to accessing public services in rural areas. Now, this obviously varies quite widely across countries. Some countries will overcome those problems by actually providing services that are accessible at no cost, but often there are some costs involved, even when the services are free. And certainly you will all have experiences in different areas of that here in Ireland. Just interesting to note, there's a new report, I think will be out in the next week or so, that's been done by the European Social Policy and Analysis Network for the European Commission, which is looking at the implementation of the European Child Guarantee across all of the key services covered by the guarantee. And I've seen a sneak preview of it, and it has sections for each policy area of financial barriers to accessing. And I haven't seen it, but I understand that there's a specific Irish report as well, and I think that will probably be published. But don't quote me on that, but I just keep an eye on the Commission website. In terms, then, my fourth point is about giving special attention to those most at risk. And this has been stressed strongly at the European level. If we look at investing in children, it says ensure a focus on children who face an increased risk due to multiple disadvantage, such as Roma children, some migrant or ethnic minority children, children with special needs or disabilities, children in alternative care and street children, children of imprisoned parents, as well as children within households at particular risk of poverty, such as single parent or large families. And then the European Child Guarantee asks member states to give particular attention when it's looking at children in need to homeless children or children experiencing severe housing deprivation, children with disabilities, children with mental health issues, children with a migrant background or minority ethnic origin, particularly Roma, children in alternative, especially institutional care, and children in precarious family situations. And it gives quite an extensive definition on what it means by precarious family situations. Now, I really look forward to the panel. I'm sure you can all add to that list or emphasize particular groups in it. I don't think there's Commission listed rural, but it did come up in a lot of the work that we did, and I'm sure Seamus will be telling us more about that. Okay, point 5, the need for a suite of policies, that there is no one policy that will assure an adequate income. And I think that is a strong thing that comes out in the various commissions' guidance on child poverty. First of all, we have, and it also, of course, came across very strongly from all the feasibility studies and consultations we did for the Child Guarantee. So the first thing that stands out, the importance of supporting parents' participation in the labour market, ensuring that work pays, supporting employability, ensuring family-friendly working, ensuring affordable childcare. All those are elements, and there's quite a lot of detail in the various reports on those about parents' access to the labour market, but in ways that fits in also with having families. Then the second bit that comes across strongly is a need for strong social protection policies. Establish and benchmark at an adequate level on benefits supporting families and children. There's been a lot of work at European level on the importance of children's benefits. And I think, interestingly, about the value of having a universal benefit because it meets the needs of all children and gets political support, but often that can never be at a level that is sufficient to support the needs of the most disadvantaged children. And of course, the ESRI's report last week, I think, was particularly interested in this, on having a supplementary and more targeted benefit as an interesting option, and I'm sure people may discuss that a bit more. But it's not just then about income from work, and it's not just about strong social protection policies, but an adequate income also depends on supports in kind. The amount of income that a family needs depends how much other things cost. So supports in kind, whether it's help with housing costs, or heating costs, or free healthcare, or medicines, or available free early childhood education, or help with the costs of school books, or after-school activities, or providing free school meals, or ensuring free transport available for children to participate in activities. There are a whole range of things that affect what income families actually need and the extent that those types of services are provided in kind or not provided that you have to take into account. A few other things that sort of come up from the European experience that you need to take into account when discussing what is an adequate income is the higher costs faced by particular groups that I think especially or obviously with children with disabilities or families with disabilities, the higher costs for older children, the problems of complexity in systems, so it's difficult for people to access them and trying to provide reasonably simple systems, the need to make sure that you're reaching the children on the margins. And then I think one of the really important points when we're talking about adequate income is never to lose sight that we need to look at providing adequate income in the context of accessing other services as well in a wraparound way that really reaches the families most in need, and delivering services in a way that there is an outreach that will find people who are sometimes difficult to access. And again, I just remember various of the consultations we had during the child guarantee, the importance of outreach, importance of getting to families early and combining income support with other services if you are really going to have a significant impact and effect. And you'll be glad to know my final point. I just wanted to stress that an adequate income for children is an investment, not a cost. If we look at the high costs of children growing up in poverty, it undermines social solidarity and cohesion, it increases social costs, it increases family insecurity, it damages the environment and undermines efforts to create a sustainable future, and it has high economic costs and reduces economic productivity. And I quote a couple of studies there. I won't go into the details, but you can look at them. But actually, there has been good work done on how much it costs if children grow up in poverty later. It's an expense. So you actually, if you spend money now, you will save a lot of money in the future. Thus, ensuring adequate income is an investment in children's development that will improve educational achievement, general health, skills, labour productivity, economic growth, social cohesion, social capital, as well as a sustainable environment. An investment in ending intergenerational poverty is the other thing that will come from investing in adequate income from children early on. So conclusions, 4 conclusions. We will have achieved an adequate income for children when the income and resources available for every child's upbringing guarantee a standard of living which ensures their social, emotional, and physical well-being and development, and their participation in the normal activities and opportunities in the society in which they live. My second point, the future of democracy depends on building more equal, inclusive, and sustainable societies. Ending child poverty is key to achieving this. Ensuring adequate income for all children is an essential element in achieving this goal. Conclusion 3. We do know what needs to be done. Child poverty can be ended. It just requires political leadership and courage. We have waited long enough. The time to act decisively here in Ireland is now. And my 4th conclusion, as we go forward, keep listening to children and young people experiencing poverty and their parents and guardians. They know best what needs to be done and where the weaknesses in the systems are. And one final thought, ensuring an adequate income for children and their families must increasingly take account of the costs of adjusting to climate change, will hit the poorest most. Ensuring a just transition is vital for an adequate income for children. But equally, ensuring an adequate income for children is an essential element in combating climate change and building a sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hugh, for a really, really interesting presentation, and a presentation that really highlighted the different ways that poverty impacts children's lives, but I think also giving a lot of hope for the future in terms of the policy momentum, both at a European level and here in Ireland around the issue of child poverty. We do have a little time now for questions to Hugh, so I might open it up to the floor. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and we can get started. I think there's a roving mic there as well. Any burning questions? Yes, here in the front.
Thanks very much. Bernard Mulvaney is my name. I'm Access for All Ireland. We actually have become very involved in our campaign began around transport, but we've become very involved now in the discussion around poverty, particularly for the caring community and children with disabilities. I myself I'm a carer and the parent of a child with a disability. Just on one particular issue, we were the first to highlight this when the speech was made around the PUP. Government decided that €350 was the minimum needed to survive in Ireland when COVID hit, because they had to furlough so many people. That evening, myself and young Sean, who does the campaign with me, who is disabled, we put together a little proposal how, if that's the minimum needed to survive, then why are people with disabilities on €208, why are carers on 220, and why are pensioners and single parents as well, we brought that into it, on 256 single parents on 220. So we assumed, we put it out there in the ether in social media, that all payments would be brought up to the minimum needed to survive. It actually resonated with people, and it took off to the point that government were a bit upset with us. COVID came and went, and there was an issue around €1,000 payment for caring, for people who are caring, like our nurses and our frontline healthcare workers, and we 100% agreed with that. We put it out there again on a particular night. A government minister was on telly talking about this payment, and we put it out there. The caring community, we assumed that they would be receiving the €1,000. The response was caring in home is different than caring in the community. And it was interesting because actually some MEPs picked up on this engagement that launch, so government was very upset with us, and we met with them. And it was a bizarre engagement, but at the end of the conversation, it came back to the €350. €350 was the minimum needed to survive, but yet whole range of society is on so much less. And the response we got was, it was a very good point, a very valid point, but it would cost too much money. So in that instance, we have a young man with a disability who was there with myself, a carer, and what we were told was, you're not worth it. And it just struck us there and then that that's, what we're up against. So, I mean, wonderful research that's done that comes out, particularly Maynooth University. We engaged with some, Rory Hearn in particular, around housing and the issues there and all that. We're involved in the Cost of Living Coalition. We were the first to row in with that, and then Inclusion Ireland came in. We've got FUS, Disability Power, all these young people with disabilities, families with disabilities, single parents, all highlighting this inequality, and it's there, and you can read it, and it's glaring. It's on our streets. We walk around, we see it. Our travelling community live in abject poverty, but yet we still don't see that change, that mentality, that investing, like you said, in our communities, in people, in those who need it the most, it benefits society on a wider level. I feel personally that it's always monetized, and the return is dictated, and if the return is denoted as not good enough, so people with disabilities a lot of the time can't wholly activate themselves into the workplace, therefore the return isn't great. But how can we change that? How can we get that mindset to change, that when you invest in people, when you give people dignity in their life, that the return to society far outweighs any monetary return? So that's what I'm going to ask you.
Thanks very much. And I think a lot of this will be kind of touched upon in the panel discussion, but Hugh, I don't know if you want to come back on that.
Yes, I think the way we changed is listening to people like you. That, as you say, endless reports and analysis and evidence, but it's actually changing attitudes in society. And I think a key word you mentioned during that was inequality. We need to build societies that are more equal. And there's a lot of evidence on this. It's a lot about what our forthcoming book is about, and that means an attitude change about what the nature of society is. And that's a very big challenge. I think there is an opportunity in relation to children, and also recognizing the extra costs that some groups particularly face. I do think that to have now a unit at the heart of government at Taoiseach's level, something we always argued for in my days way back in combat poverty, that things only really changed when they got to Taoiseach's department because they could actually force other departments to pay attention. Whether that can be built in politically, regardless of changes of government, so it becomes a requirement of society to include everybody. It's a challenge, and that depends on all of us making these arguments and getting the political change that is necessary to achieve them. But if I knew an easy answer, I would have implemented it years ago or argued for it. But you're absolutely right. It's making those sort of points makes a big difference, and getting other people to hear them and saying them in a way like that can get heard beyond just academics and politicians, but can be heard by society as a whole. It's a big challenge.
Thanks, Hugh. I was struck by your fifth point in relation to the suite of policy measures that are needed to address poverty and improve income adequacy. And I suppose there's potential here with the Child Poverty Unit in terms of coordinating that. Is there any countries in Europe that get the policy mix right, and is there anything Ireland can learn in that regard from other countries?
Yeah, I think the country probably I was most impressed by very often during the consultations on the child guarantee was Finland, which really seems to look much more seriously at joining up policies together. And right down to the ground level, it actually seems to happen that people are committed to working in that way. And there were quite a lot of interesting case studies we got from that experience. So that was certainly probably the country I would go to first.
Yeah, great. Naomi?
Thanks, Hugh, for such a comprehensive and yet very succinct presentation. I think it was just really excellent in terms of setting the scene today. I suppose one of the things I've been really struck by over the last number of years, you know from the MESL research that older children cost more, and I'm sure there's a lot of parents who will say, I didn't need research to tell me that. I'm quite aware of my cupboard being bare, children growing and needing more to eat and having more expenses in terms of secondary school books, etc. And I think that that's a real cohort of children that the income adequacy issues really need to be addressed there. And probably similar to Trisha's question, I'm wondering, is there any other European countries that are looking at the costs of older children and specifically addressing that? I know in Ireland we had a differentiation of the increase for qualified child rate in a number of budgets, increasing it so that there's a higher amount given for parents of older children. So I just wonder if you had any specific insights on that. Thanks a million.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. It's not to say that the answer isn't there. I think quite a lot of good material is collected by the Social Protection Committee of the Commission on different schemes. So it should be available and comparable. But off the top of my head, I don't know the answer. But just a general point I'd make is I'm sort of conscious that a lot of the emphasis of what we did in the child guarantee was early intervention and looking at young children. Absolutely critical, but then several people began to say to us, don't forget older children, young people also have needs, and indeed we need to also look at their income needs because they're not the same through the age range. So I think it's a really important point and would be worth cross-checking to see exactly who does it better.
Any other questions? No? Great. Okay, thanks very much, Hugh, for your input this morning. It's been really, really insightful and really good way to kind of kick off the event. So I'm now going to invite our panellists so we can start our panel discussion. So we have Louise from Spark, Paul Gordon from the National Youth Council, Derval from Inclusion Ireland, Seamus from Irish Rural Link, and Sarah Sid from the Irish Refugee Council. While people are getting settled, I'd just like to remind people who are online and those in the room today that please tweet along, share the content using the hashtag #EndChildPovertyWeek. So does everybody have water? We're all good to go? Great. Okay. Derval, I might start with you. So we know, when we look at the statistics on child poverty, we know children with disabilities, parents with disabilities have a much higher rate of poverty. So can you tell us a little bit about what's the experience for those families and, what are the solutions that you see as well?
Great, thank you, and lovely to be here with you all today and with my fellow panellists as well. Yeah, I suppose we engage directly with families and with children every day of the week through our information and support line, through consultations. And our latest consultation, just pre-budget, where we reached out to families asking them about their lived experience, was quite stark, the findings. So 50% of families who responded to our budget survey said that they struggle to pay the bills. And 27% of families said that they consistently struggle to pay the bills over time. So that's very significant in our community. And I suppose if we peel back the layers of what's going on there systemically and what's happening for children and their families and why children are existing in poverty within their families, disabled children are existing in poverty within their families, you can see there's a couple of issues, well, there's a number of issues going on, but just to draw our attention to one or two of them today. If your child happens to be born with an intellectual disability and happens to have relatively high support needs, so might need some support and care to have a good quality of life, might need access to medical supports, might need access to support to eat and drink, to manage showering, to manage daily activities. It's almost seen as inevitable in the state that one parent, if it's a two-parent family, will need to give up work or at least reduce their working hours to manage the very real issues that their child is facing, and because the state has not stepped in to provide adequate services and support to the child. So that's almost an inevitability. So we see that all the time with families, that parents who would both like to continue to work, both like to continue to have a career, one has ended up working part-time or pulling out of the labour market altogether. So that reduces the family income. And then I suppose another key point to bring our attention to is the government themselves commissioned a report published by Indicon back in 2021, and that set out very clearly the fact that just by having a disability in Ireland, there is an additional cost. It was called the Cost of Disability Report. And that additional cost for a child or for an adult ranges anything between €9,000 up to €13,000 a year in addition, for things like extra transport costs, medicine, access to services, additional heating because your child might be at home more, even down to things like that people don't consider. If your child needs incontinence wear, your bins are weighed, there's an additional cost there. So just on every front there are additional costs, and that has been recognised by government, but unfortunately we haven't seen an implementation plan for how we're going to actually provide a cost of disability payment to every child and disabled adult in Ireland. So there's some of the couple of issues. And I suppose the direct lived experience, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention though that we need to look at this in the round and very holistically. So while income support, and I know that's what we're focused on today, is incredibly important for families, there's also, I suppose, a lack of available services and supports for children. And that is compounding the very real issues that children are facing who are existing in poverty. So I'll just give you an example. We had a parent ring us just a couple of weeks ago who said to us that he has applied to 35 schools for his child, because there is no guarantee for his child who has an intellectual disability that they will get into their local school or the next school over or the next school over. So you can imagine even that on an administrative level, the nightmare that that parent has to go through to just keep in touch with 35 schools, figure out where their child is on the waiting list, will they get in, will they not, deal with the National Council for Special Education, deal with all the professionals involved. So that's just one issue. And that parent is also dealing with struggling to access physiotherapy supports for their child. So how could that parent work full-time? How could that parent be in a position to do that when their entire time is I suppose, taken up with fighting for basic services and supports for their child? So that's a key issue. And we see also things like in our pre-budget survey, families telling us up to 27% of the families who completed the survey said that their child is travelling 30 minutes or more to go to school, and 17% of families said that their child is travelling over an hour to get to school, passing by tens and 15 and 20 local schools. So that just in and of itself, the organising of that, the time it takes to do that, is just having a direct impact on children. I will stop now in a second. I know I'm on a complete roll now, so somebody will have to wrap me up. But we've seen then the stark reality of this, of families fighting and shouting for services and supports. And last week, the Ombudsman for Children published a report called Nowhere to Turn. And if any of you have read it in the audience, it is absolutely heartbreaking about families crying out for help and with no choice but to bring their child to their local A&E and leave their child there. And a couple of case studies in that were children living in hospital with no medical needs whatsoever because the state had not stepped in to provide supports to that child and family. So we really need to, in 2023, start looking at that. And the systemic issues that are there are about we're only dealing in annual budgets, and that leads to us only dealing in crisis responses, and we need to get out of the weeds and start planning with children and families over time.
Thank you. And just going back to that issue around the cost of disability, because really it is so crucial if we are going to support people with disabilities out of poverty. And I suppose thinking about the trajectory and the balance between income supports and services, what would Inclusion Ireland like to see in terms of how that pathway is mapped out by government?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. It needs to be a balance. So last year, there were definite improvements in budget that were welcomed by many family carers, such as an increase in income disregard. There was also a cessation, thankfully, of the archaic process of cancelling carers allowance when your child is in hospital for an extended period of time. Now your child can be in hospital for 6 months and your carers allowance is still protected. So there were some improvements last year, and we obviously need to see more of that. But side by side and in parallel, absolutely, access to services has to be part and parcel of the solution. So in our pre-budget submission, we talked a lot about an extensive workforce planning strategy, for example, because we're seeing that the waiting lists across the country to get any kind of access to speech and language therapy, physio, occupational therapy, 1/3 of the therapy teams are at the moment vacant. So we need a really good, solid plan to tackle that as well, side by side with the income supports that need to be there for families.
Thank you. Louise, if I could go to you next. I suppose when we look at the poverty statistics, people with disabilities and lone parents consistently have the highest rates of poverty. And if we look to the European context, Ireland does really, really poorly in terms of the living standards of lone parents. What do you think are the key challenges, or why haven't we seen the necessary investments in one-parent families?
If I'm being honest, Tricia, I think it's political will, because there's enough research there to show what the problems are and what the solutions are. We know there are 4 things that really are important to support lone parent families. That would be adequate, good quality housing, childcare, a robust child maintenance system, and well-supported, well-paid employment opportunities. In all those areas, we are failing drastically. You know, you published a report back in 2019 which showed that the policies that were implemented to try to activate lone parents only impacted working lone parents and increased poverty rates over double. So lone parents in work, it went from 1 in 11 lone parents in work were living in poverty, and it went up to 1 in 5 in that 5-year period. That's outrageous, that, you know, that even working doesn't get lone parents out of poverty. The housing crisis, I work in Focus Ireland, so on a daily basis we see the real issues for lone parents. They, in fact, since the lifting of the eviction ban in March, if we look at the increase in figures, there's been 200 extra families increase in family homelessness, 200. Out of that 200, 143 are lone parent households. There's been a disproportionate increase, and it's difficult then to get out of homelessness as a lone parent, because you can't even go to viewings, you can't work if you're trying to manage in a hostel. So if we look at child maintenance then, you know, we've been pushing for child maintenance for years. We know that a lot of children are living in poverty because they're not being adequately supported by both parents. We have no robust child maintenance system in Ireland. You know, we were really hopeful that after contributing and supporting the work around the Child Maintenance Review Group, the report was published last November. Despite the fact that 4 out of the 7 on the panel argued that we do need a statutory maintenance agency. We're being told that won't happen, and we're still going to rely on the courts. And again, there were some positive things that came out of the report, that the maintenance would be disregarded from an assessment of social welfare means, all really positive things, but it's almost a year later and that hasn't been implemented yet. And it's urgent for those people who are relying on that money and are struggling. And then, so we've, and the childcare, while childcare has improved, and, we have to say, there has been some major improvements in the National Childcare Scheme, it is not reaching those parents who are lone parents who are working in part-time retail and hospitality jobs that are expected to work in the evenings, or retail jobs expected to work in the evenings. The National Childcare Scheme caters for a civil servant type of employment where people are dropping their children in at 8 o'clock and collecting them at 6 o'clock. Many lone parents are not in that position to do those jobs, and then they are excluded from the National Childcare Scheme. And some of the very specific childcare schemes that were there to support lone parents would be like the SET scheme that allowed them to go back into education and training, the CCS scheme. They've all been taken out and put in case, instead of very targeted supports for lone parents, it was the universal support. Ultimately, it probably will be better in the long term, but for the moment, there are lone parents suffering because of the changes to the National Childcare Scheme. And then just to get back to Professor Fraser's point about that balance between targeted and universal supports, what we saw in Budget 23 in the midst of a cost of living crisis was the wrong balance. So for instance, if we look at children and income supports, the IQC rate, which supports the poorest children, those dependent on social welfare, they got an annual increase of €2 a week or €104 a year. Child benefit, which is the targeted, or the universal payment, which goes to every parent whether they need it or not, that went up by €240 in the year on the one-off payments. Now, why did we more than double the universal payment and only have €104 for the children poorest? And as we know, most of those are lone parent households or those with disabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. And just on that point, I suppose, obviously to really comprehensively address poverty among lone parent households, we do need that joined up thinking. But I suppose, what would you see as the first key steps if you're thinking about budget 2024? Where do the resources need to go, and how do we need to get them to those families?
The resources, this budget, there's obviously structural changes that need to happen, but in the context of this year, we really need to strongly increase the increase for the qualified child rate. That is a way of targeting money into the poorest children. There's real life consequences for children who did not get the support last year. And I've been dealing, as part of Spark, I've been working with families for over 10 years, and I see the consequences, and I never saw it as bad as last year. And I always think I'm in touch with people because I am working with people who are experiencing poverty. And something happened to me recently that really shook me and went, God, even I'm getting out of the context. So for instance, there was a post put up in our group. We have a closed group where parents express their concerns and worries. And somebody put up a very innocuous post saying, have you all noticed the increases in your shopping bill? And everybody, of course, went, yeah, my bill's gone from here and my bill's gone from there. And there was that whole talk about it. And then one woman put up, and I still get really emotional when I think about it. She put up, no, my shopping hasn't gone up. I have the same budget every week. I'm bringing home less every week. And when she put that post up, loads of other women started coming in and saying the same. And so what the answer was, we're bringing home less. So far, we're protecting the children. But I'm going to Hungary. And one parent I know, and I know her really well, like I'd consider her a friend, she told me that she always struggled to make it to the end of the week. Thursday is payday for people on social welfare and lone parents. She said usually Wednesday was always a bad day. You couldn't go to the shops or whatever. But she said from Monday, she's eating toast Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And that's the reality. And unless we do these really targeted supports, like increasing the qualified child rate, and also lone parents are the only group who are on long-term welfare who don't get the living alone allowance, even though they're living alone. So that's where you have this idea, they're trying to run a household out of a social welfare payment of €220. It is not adequate, and the money that's supposed to be going to support the needs, the material needs of their children, is being used to fund the household bills. That needs to change as well. Lone parents need the living alone allowance if they're living alone, and we need immediate resources put into the increase for qualified child rate.
Thanks, Louise. Sarah, if I can come to you next.
Thank you.
Obviously, a lot of organisations who are campaigning for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers were quite disappointed in Budget 2023 that there was no increase in the daily allowance for children living in direct provision. Children living in very, very extreme poverty and deprivation. I know you've done some research with the Irish Refugee Council, going out and actually talking to families. Could you tell me a little bit about this research and what parents and families are saying to you?
Yes, thank you, Tricia. Thank you for having me. Thank you also to the Irish Refugee Council for trusting me to represent them here today. And yes, we were able to carry out this research funded by the Human Rights Commission. The paper is still forthcoming, but the analysis has been completed and the findings are final. So this research explores the experiences of families living in direct provision, the challenges they face, and the impact of income inadequacy and of not receiving child benefit on their lives and on children's well-being. So just like you point out, direct provision is an inequitable system with varying conditions across centers. And yes, children in direct provision who are without status in Ireland receive a daily expenses allowance, or DEA, payment of €29.80 per week, as opposed to the €40 that one would receive in child benefit. Also, there is another DEA for adults that is €38.80 per week. So to really understand the extent of income inadequacy that asylum seekers face, one must really dive deep into their circumstances and into the living conditions that direct provision imposes on them. So what makes asylum seekers particularly vulnerable? Because much of what has been said already, of course, applies to them, but they are also vulnerable in very particular ways. For instance, as many of you might know already, parents are not able to work. Asylum seekers are not permitted to work for their first 6 months in Ireland. And really, this ends up being closer to a year, because after month 5, they can apply for a work permit. This permit might take months to be approved, and then they have to look for employment, which it's also important to keep in mind that many direct provision centers are located in very small towns, small villages, very remote locations. So finding employment might come at varying degrees of difficulty, but it's hard in places like this. One more thing, asylum seekers face language barriers that other people who are settled in Ireland do not. And this also relates to their ability to find employment once they can work. One more thing, asylum seekers are newcomers to this country. They have no network, no social safety net. And so what all of these and others amount to is that these families are completely dependent on the government for everything. For accommodation, to receive food, to receive a medical card and access to healthcare, and just to receive the means to live. Very often, the means they receive are poor, and the poor living conditions and inadequate access to basic amenities and basic necessities within direct provision centers means that asylum seekers are often unable to meet the most basic of their needs while living here. To give a couple examples, food. Something as basic as food is very inadequate. This is especially the case, although it's not exclusive to, centers where the accommodation prepares meals for residents, as opposed to other arrangements where residents are provided the means to get their own ingredients and prepare their own food. This simply does not work for anyone. The food is not adequate for adults, and then let alone adults, but imagine children and babies. So to give maybe another example, these residents are very rarely supported with basic toiletries, cleaning products, and just basic items for people who have children or babies, such as clothing for fast-growing children and changing seasons, or diapers or milk or wipes for babies. So all of these shortages play a very large role in understanding just how insufficient the DEA payment is, because there's this common misconception that the DEA is this sort of additional or discretionary income that comes to asylum seekers once all of their basic needs have been met. However, this is far from reality, and with basic needs not covered by the government or at the center, asylum seekers have no choice but to spend the DEA on covering these basic needs, leaving little to no funds for other expenses and sometimes not being enough to cover these. And so what this leads to is at least one of the two following outcomes. For some people, some families are not able to cover basic needs such as food, transportation, basic items, even after supplementing with the DEA. This makes it impossible for them to lead a life with the most basic dignity. Or second, and this is the case for most families, families are unable to cover other needs, and they disregard other needs, such as cultural needs, social needs, extracurriculars, leisure, which of course one could easily argue that these are also very basic. And in some ways, this is also particularly harsh on children who live in direct provision, because direct provision centers are rarely suitable for children to play, to run, to be loud, and just to be children, really. Families often find themselves confined to their rooms, and it came as no surprise to hear from many mothers that summer was brutal on them because children are not in school, and so children are in their rooms all the time, sometimes with not even enough space for babies to crawl. Also, I think it's very important to keep in mind that asylum-seeking children go to school with Irish peers, and they notice that they have it different, and they feel singled out, and they are unable to integrate, which I just quite frankly find it heartbreaking. So in sum, this research is a call for current conditions and non-financial support, that is, what we offer asylum seekers in terms of accommodation, nutrition, transportation support, etc., to improve. And second, for the DEA to increase, or for child benefit to become truly universal and to cover asylum-seeking children. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I think that really starkly illustrates the very desperate situation people living in direct provision are faced with every day. So thanks very much. Paul, if I could go to you. Obviously, when the last economic crash hit, young people were hit very, very hard, and we still have like a legacy of that in terms of how they're treated in the social welfare system. Could you speak to me a little bit about the impact that has on young people and maybe where you see the key opportunities and challenges are in relation to that?
Sure. So I suppose the point to make is that children don't age out of poverty. Once you turn 18, it doesn't automatically stop, and then the stats bear that out. So if you've grown up in poverty, you're 35% more likely than someone from a financial background that's considered very good to experience poverty throughout your life, and it's more likely that younger people at that ebb are likely to experience it as well. So we have a situation where after 2009, lower rates of job seekers allowance were phased in for young people under 26. That's been changed to 25 now, which is positive, but it's a very small step. As it stands, that means that young people under 25 receive €90 less of an allowance, and it's called an allowance, which sounds quite like pocket money, and it's really not. It's about it's funding people's basic subsistence. The rationale for it was based on absolutely no evidence. The idea behind it was that it would stop dependence on welfare, would incentivize people to find work, to go on work placement programs. And what the Department of Social Protection's own poverty impact assessment that they did in recent years found that there was an actual stark increase in poverty point indicators for young people aged 18 to 24 or 25 at the time. And there was also a dramatic increase in that group experiencing deprivation compared to the rest of the population. So one might be able to understand that rationale. Now, there's no evidence behind it. in a context where there's youth unemployment that's at something like 30%. Currently, we have what economists call a tight labour market, plenty of jobs available, and the youth unemployment rate and the rate of just project. Oh, it's back. Not in education or training has fallen dramatically. It's quite low. The group currently out of work, out of education, out of training, they're people who need the most support to get into employment. And it's not about just a training course to get into a job. It is stepwise. It's individual development programs. It's personal development programs that are really tailored to them. And they're more expensive to put in place. But they're drastically needed. It's really an opportunity now that the government has when it will actually cost less to remove the lower rates. It will cost less to remove the lower rates than it might have a few years previously. But there needs to be that investment that Professor Fraser mentioned earlier, spending now to save later, to ensure that people are equipped with the skills, maybe not to get a job now, but in a year or 2 years. And those people, there's a lot of groups represented here today who are overrepresented within that group of young people. So people with disabilities, lone parents, people from a migrant background, people with substance use issues, people with mental health issues who need that additional support. And unfortunately, paying them €90 less a week than their friends and colleagues aged 25 and above is frankly a discriminatory policy. We see that, I suppose, systematic discrimination in other policy areas relating to the labour market. So under 20s are subject to lower rates of the minimum wage. So young people under 25 on job seekers allowance will receive €4,700 less a year. Young people aged 18 doing the same job as someone aged 20 will earn €4,000 less a year gross. So, I mean, we're effectively, I don't want to say impoverishing people, but paying poverty wages and ensuring that young people under 25 actually we're creating a greater culture of dependency if they're receiving a lower rate. Because €129.80 a week is what they're receiving. Barely enough to cover, it's not enough to cover your basic necessities. We all know the costs of getting a job, public transport, whatever else that are needed to get into the workplace. And if we're not giving people enough to do that, they're going to be stuck on that same rate for a long time. And we know that in the life course, people who spend longer out of employment have lower lifetime earnings and are significantly affected. So it's really challenging, and I think there's a few measures that could be taken to address that. And I think a lot of the groups here today, I was thinking coming in about the various kind of policy measures that have not gotten evidence bases that effectively discriminate against young people, and I was going to ask the question, well, are they an easy target when it comes to the need to make cuts? But I think there's lots of groups in the room that would also make that very same argument. And I mean, in terms of addressing that in the broader perspective, it's really about actually organising. It's a really challenging thing to do, but developing that political will that Louise spoke about to ensure that the necessary changes take place to address really quite stark inequalities, not just for young people, but many groups represented here today.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and I think when we're talking about young people, that issue around decent work and being able to facilitate that transition into decent work. And I suppose we obviously have a commitment around a living wage now from government. Do you think that is the way we should be looking at it, or how do services build in, I suppose, that balance between income and services that we're talking about, particularly if you think about how high rents and things like that?
I suppose in terms of a living wage, the recommendation from the Low Pay Commission was that we maintain the sub-minimum rates for under 20s. So we're automatically disadvantaging young people. Now there's a review by the Commission and by DSRI, which will be shortly published, which we do hope listens to the evidence from many. We're one of only 6 EU member states that has lower rates of pay for a specific younger cohort. We'd certainly say that needs to be addressed. It's I mean, I will say a simple piece of legislation. No piece of legislation is simple, but it can be addressed by legislation. It would in fact be a revenue raiser for the state through additional taxes earned by young people if they were paid slightly higher. A living wage certainly is a way to go. At the moment, obviously, we've had COVID. Young people did feel the brunt of layoffs in terms of employment, they were supported by the PUP. That was a help. But so it's coming back to the living wage. You do need to build the services in around it. And I think there is a link between discriminatory policies towards under 25s and the broader social picture in terms of services as it relates to housing. Because we're effectively, if we're ensuring that young people aren't actually being paid an adequate wage, and young people, by and large, they're 6 times more likely to be on low wage or on temporary contracts. They're far more likely to be on lower wages, that they're not going to be able to afford basic services. But if we're actually putting in place discriminatory policies for the most vulnerable young people, we're actually ensuring that they're not going to be able to access housing over the life course. So that there is an interlink between a lack of public and social housing, but also policies that are, I suppose, effectively meant to incentivise economic participation and participation in the labour market, which frankly isn't happening for what is currently a small cohort of young people out of work or education or training, but also in the broader picture.
Thank you. Seamus, if I can come to you last but not least. If we look at the stats again, half of children in poverty live in rural areas. And we know in SVP that rural poverty can look different than in urban areas. Can you tell me what are the key issues and what you think are the key solutions in relation to addressing that?
Thanks, Tricia. And look, it's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be able to work with Children's Rights Alliance over the year, especially their scorecard, which really is a fundamental tool in measuring child poverty, and they are to be commended for keeping that going. I think the best way to look at rural poverty, and in Irish Rural Link we're very clear, we don't like saying, you know, the rural is better or worse, or, you know, we don't like that kind of separation, because poverty is like the rain. It's not location specific, it arrives everywhere. But sometimes the policies are decided by location, and I'm going to give you a good example of a policy that's truly dependent on location, but which doesn't work in a rural context. And I think that explains the difference in poverty. And it's the DEIS schools. You all know the DEIS schools. They're a brilliant, brilliant system. And they're a system which, when they're working, they tackle all sorts of issues for young children, especially at national school system. And I can count, I would need 4 hands to count the number of reports. Last one I was involved in myself in 2016, which says the earlier the intervention, whether it's a child with disability, with difficult circumstances, the more likely that child may get out of that cycle that we talk about. So the DEIS system, think about it, it's a school located in various areas, but in rural areas, there are few of them. That means if you have a household experiencing difficulties, whether it's poverty, children with high learning difficulties, they don't have access to the suite of services that are available in their normal school. So therefore, they can't get access to those services. Now, there are some allowances made in modern, apologies, there are some allowances made in certain circumstances. For example, if a child has a particular serious difficulty, they then can be placed in a DEIS school. But think about that. That means their siblings are going to the local school and they are singled out, you know. So I highlight that because the reports are there. Hugh has talked about the numerous reports. My panel colleagues are all quoting from reports. The reports exist about what it is we have to do. Bernard, in his question earlier on, talked about the exasperation of, given the evidence, why do we still have to deal with the word no? And at the risk, and you won't forgive me for this, of giving you an earworm, there's a song written many years ago by Mac Davis. It's recorded by Elvis Presley, Dolly Parton, a whole range of it. You know what it is, In the Ghetto. Think about it. I'm sorry if you have that earworm for the rest of your day. But that song depicts the story of a life born into poverty, living through poverty, and tragically ending, all because of poverty. The ghetto is another word for poverty. Every single report, from the ones Hugh talks about, Fintan O'Toole, the panelists here this morning, say that if we keep doing the things the way we do them, then we shouldn't expect different outcomes. And yet it is a mindset, because, and I have to say this, because I'm trying to, the rural situation, I will come back to it, Tricia, but I think if you just solve the problem of poverty, it will be solved in rural areas as well. But think about it in terms of attitude. We were told that it would be in 2019, before COVID, we all saw the GDP figures, we all saw the economic figures. Not one of them predicted COVID. And in that case, there were dire warnings that we can't spend any more money on this, that, and the other. What happened? We had a crisis, we had a pandemic, and suddenly the money was found. Only a couple of weeks ago, we have a pandemic crime situation in Dublin. Suddenly, a lot of money was found to provide extra police hours on the streets of Dublin. I know, because my earlier life was in youth work. I happened to be, about 3 weeks before that crisis evolved, talking to some young youth workers, in some cases in the very areas these crimes are committed, who were let go because their projects had come to the end of their funding life. These are people, and I've done this myself, working on the streets as youth workers, talking to the young people on the streets who are in these difficulties. And it's a very great skill. You think about it, how many here will walk up into the middle of the more difficult areas, as they're called, and start engaging with young people who are unstable, to be polite? That takes enormous skill. Yet the state continuously underfunds these projects. It continuously makes them short-term, and it continuously ends them. And then a crime is committed, and how do we solve this? We put more guards on the street. And of course, that's about as useless as snow on a rope, because you are not tackling fundamental issues. Going back to that, many reports on intervention and early interventions, and going back to that song. So coming back, Tricia, to the rural situation. Rural poverty is invisible. That's the problem with it. That's been a long-standing finding from numerous reports, going back to the original report, which I think Hugh was involved in back in the very early 90s. So unfortunately, you have situations of poverty in a number of households, in a number of areas, but it doesn't appear and it's not visible. So therefore, the policies which are often implemented in a kind of in a location base miss the rural areas in big time. And therefore, you end up with a number of young people, especially, going on the wrong side, probably ending up here on the streets in Dublin. People say there's no homelessness, or not a lot of homelessness in rural areas. But of course, as continuous studies have shown, when you speak to the homeless here in Dublin, more than likely, quite a number of them have come from rural villages and towns. So I think it's about solving poverty. It's about having a universal education system, not one like the DEIS, sort of there. You know, why can't, if we know how to teach our children using a DEIS school, why can't we just apply that to all the schools? Like, we have a universal child benefit program, children's allowances. Why don't we just attach the universal to the word education? Why does a child have to either not get the services they need at 2 and 3 years of age, and then go through life being at a complete disadvantage? Why? Because we don't regard poverty or attach it or improve it in a universal way. We selectively try to target it here, there and everywhere. But as far as children is concerned, at least we got it right with the children's allowance. It's universal. Can we not use the word universal in a few other programs as well?
Important point there around political prioritisation. You know, obviously we've had a number of budgets now where it was Brexit was the priority, pandemic, cost of living, and a lot of the issues all the panel are talking about are around structural issues that require investment over a number of years. And if you take income inadequacy, you know, how do we push through? And you know, obviously we have a child poverty unit now, but how is the issue kept on the political agenda? And maybe other panelists want to come in on this as well as yourself, Seamus.
I think the income adequacy is always there, and I hate to say it, it's probably going to be always there. I mean, I think, was it Louise, you were talking about being a single parent and trying to balance low-paid jobs. Well, if you live in a rural area, that's not often a choice, because the distance between going to that low-paid job and an extra child time care needed while you're at that job makes that job impossible anyway. So the income adequacy is a real issue, and there seems to be no attempt. You know, the idea of giving €300 a week is almost seen as, oh, how could we manage? The country will fall on its knees. No bankers will do as much as the children of Ireland if we pay people €300 a week. And €300 a week is hardly enough either. But what I go back to the services available in schools, in childcare, in even youth work. I go back to that area. If we commit ourselves to that, here's one little thing, the smallest thing they could do to show they really make sense, going back to access. If you live further, if you live 3.5 kilometres, I think, 3.2, from a school, you can walk, you can cycle, or more than likely on rural roads, you have to get a car to bring you to school. Why have we that 3.2 kilometre limit? The school bus is often passing by the door. The simplest little thing to do is to drop that and allow all children access to buses going to school. Would be such a simple, it would also be a symbol, and this is my point. There are two symbols from a rural perspective that hang out there that tell you why inequality is rampant. The DESH and the school transport system.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to come in on that point around? Yeah, Sarah. Yeah.
I just wanted to say transportation is actually another one of the largest challenges that asylum seekers face. And even for families with children who go to school, when there is a transportation system in place, this is usually a school bus that can cost anything between €30 and €75. So in the best case scenario where it costs €30 per week, there goes the whole DEA allowance for children. So it's really that stark.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time now for questions from the floor. So if anybody would like to put a question to the panel, please raise your hand.
Hey, I'm Mark from the Children's Rights Alliance. Just for Paul, just in relation to... Is that just me? Okay, great. With the National Youth Council, just your actual members and like youth workers, what would they kind of see on the ground running, like the main impacts for job poverty?
Yeah, so I suppose we've run surveys with our members in the last couple of years, specifically around the cost of living, to kind of understand that impact, and we've obviously asked questions around the level of deprivation in communities. And interestingly, we did one around last August, September, and another this maybe March, April this year. And last year there was clearly a sign that deprivation was taking more hold in the communities that our members work with. 3 in 4 said they had seen a growth in deprivation among the young people they work with. But in our second survey, what was really stark and different from the previous one, where we'd asked people to kind of give their testimony of issues coming through, and the most recent one, unprompted, half of people responded mentioning either food poverty or young people not having enough food, and the challenges in actually engaging young people in youth work in the first place if they're not getting the right food, they're not getting the right heating at home. Many families, effectively ensuring that young people are staying in the youth centre for longer because it's warmer. It also has an impact on our members. They have very tight budgets, and their food budgets have dramatically increased as a result of increased demand, and in terms of the sheer numbers coming to youth centres, but also the actual costs of meeting overheads. So it's really been a huge challenge, and food poverty is something that came through really, really starkly last time. More than half of the respondents mentioned it unprompted, which was a surprise for us, because previously there were a few, I suppose, different issues filtering through. Obviously reports of youth homelessness, they're disproportionately represented. Between, I think, June 21 and 23, there was a 95% increase in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds accessing emergency accommodation, and that's not accounting for, and Louise can speak to this better with her Focus Ireland hat on maybe, but that's not accounting for the number of young people in hidden homelessness as well.
Anybody else have any questions? Yes, Steve.
Thanks very much. So Steve Moffat from Bernardo's. Question I have was what Paul alluded to when you mentioned developing the political will, and obviously when you're chatting about children and youth, it's appreciating that it's multiple other sectors, and Tricia, you came back to the point a bit, is a bit about how do we take or develop the political will, but also how do we take the politics out of it, in the run up to this budget. And what we will probably or possibly are likely to see in this budget is, looking towards the so-called squeezed middle to some extent. And I suppose the people have views on how we can take some of the politics out of it when we make decisions around income adequacy, but also how can we develop that political will. I think there is probably an issue in Ireland, as well as other countries, in which some higher earners probably don't appreciate that they are higher earners. They feel like they're being squeezed. I think we saw that through the cost of living issue. Certainly, we would have seen it in some of our services, that individuals thinking they were squeezed to the point that in comparison to other areas where they, the deprivation levels had dropped really substantially. So just people have views on that.
Louise, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an issue around political will, and even there's the issue around child poverty. There's a lot of people in in society who agree with lifting children out of poverty, but they do judge parents who have children in poverty, and that's the issue. To really lift children out of poverty, you've got to lift a family income, and people seem to think that. That doing that, you're supporting feckless parents, whereas not acknowledging that it's the systemic barriers that are putting people into these situations. Housing being a massive one. Paul just alluded there to hidden homelessness. It's massive for younger people, but also for lone parents. Last week, I think, or the week before last, there was the CSO came out with their report on housing, and one of the interesting things was the amount of young people living at home under 30, and everybody was talking about that 500,000 people. But another really interesting statistic came out was the amount of lone parents who are no longer living independently anymore. So I would consider them hidden homeless as well. So up in 2011, there would have been 90% of lone parents would have lived independently with their children. That has now dropped to 85%. So that's a huge increase of people just going, I can't do it anymore, and returning to the family home or wherever they can get a support, because there's not adequate income. And then we talk about political will, and we talk about children living in poverty, and obviously the poorest children are children in emergency accommodation or direct provision, which is a form of emergency accommodation as well. I mean, there's 3,829 children registered as homeless as of last month. Again, the majority of those are going to be children in lone parent households. Some of the rules around that are in emergency accommodation, and I understand, I'm very conscious that, running an emergency accommodation with different needs is quite difficult, but some of the rules around it make it really difficult for, in particular, lone parents. There are rules in some of the emergency accommodation that say you can't cook, and I know it's the same in direct provision, but you can't cook a meal, you can't bring your children into the kitchen because of fire risks or risks around. But then also a rules that says you cannot leave your children unattended in the bedroom. So I don't know how you cook a meal if you can't bring them into the kitchen, but you can't leave them on their own. There's really specific rules like that. There's another rule that says a lot of children, a lot of rules in the emergency accommodation say you can't leave children under 16 in their room, the emergency accommodation. However, we all know that the changes made to lone parent is that lone parents are expected to be available for full-time work once their child turns 14. So what do you do with a 14-year-old? The state is telling you must go out and look for work full-time, and yet your accommodation for your teenage child will not allow them to stay. Secondary schools are only open 166 days a year. That's 200 days, potentially, the 14, 15 and 16-year-olds are left wandering the streets, and a potential risk of themselves getting injured or being groomed by criminal gangs, or just their mental well-being, that for their parents to access social welfare, they're supposed to be working full-time, those children wandering the streets. There's some really systemic things that are policy are there, we have the reports, it's just not happening, and I do think it is this whole idea that yes, we want to support children, but no, we can't support parents who have screwed up some way. And we need to understand that link with intergenerational poverty, and if you want to stop that continuing, you've got to support the parents to support the children.
Thanks, and thanks, Louise, as well. Good answer. The question you ask is actually fundamental, and I think you were asked what country is best in Europe. You mentioned Finland. You're absolutely correct. The other countries, believe it or not, doing well are Estonia, and of course the Scandinavian countries. So I think looking at those, you will find that the delivery of policies in terms of services are child-centred. The services are child-centred. The idea is that a child is entitled to a level of delivery of service at a very high level, no matter what. I have a real fear, and I hear what Louise is saying very definitely. I think we have to answer, I have a fear that they will never support income-wise, because they're talking about the whole world falling apart if we paid €300 a week. We all know in this house right here today that €300 a week is a long way short of what a really essential, I think the new phrase is essential, a minimum essential standard of living. So we need to agree on that, and I think even organizations like ourselves are probably shooting low when we're saying what is a medium essential standard of living. What is it? And I think it would be an interesting workshop to have on its own. My problem really is I don't know how long we can wait for that sort of debate and whether or not its conclusions would ever be implemented. But I do know this: if we don't start delivering services at a much higher level than we are now on a child-centered approach, then we are going to let generations of children get into teenage and adulthood who have always and who are always behind at every metric level you measure, whether it's reading power, social skills ability, employment ability, or even how they think, how they grow up and how they become mature and how they manage difficult situations and how they live with that, because they can only live by example. And the example they got 2 or 3 weeks ago was the way to shut off the crime is to fill the streets with guards. I always remember standing outside a juvenile court in Athlone in 1998 when the bail referendum, which we passed by 100% majority almost, and that was going to solve our problems. And I stood outside that juvenile court in Athlone, and I saw 3 young boys, to me, very young boys, 14 and 15, being sent, I think it was St. Patrick's. When they came out of the court, they were heroes. They had arrived. In their local area, they were now something different. I mean, you know, we have this amazing view, and that's why Finland are successful. That's why some of the Scandinavians, they just go straight to the child and they say that child will get this level of service wherever they live, whatever their circumstances. That's what they're entitled to. But I totally, Louise, accept that while we don't support low income, especially parents and the single parents, we put them at a huge deficit and disadvantage.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead, Derval, yeah.
Just in terms of political will, I think we've a bit of a hangover still that we need to get over in the country, and that is the kind of charity model or the charity approach to supporting people who are in poverty. And I think that's going to take a huge shift and change of mindset to move into a much more rights-based and human rights-based way of looking at the world. And I know obviously organisations like Children's Rights Alliance, that's absolutely the agenda they are putting forward at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, etc., and ourselves at other organisations here. So what we see is that manifest in ways like, for example, in the budget announcement last year, for the first time, there was an acknowledgement by Minister McGrath that there is an additional cost to having a disability in Ireland today. And the response at government level to that was a €500 once-off payment. So that smacks again of that old school charity model. Now, it was welcome and it was something that brought short-term relief to people, don't get me wrong, but it didn't tackle that systemic rights-based issues facing people living every day in poverty. So I guess that shift, we need to make it together. And I think, you know, in solidarity with each other and really pushing forward that agenda that this is about children's rights. That's fundamentally what this is about. It's about a more equitable and fair society. And our legislation and all of that also is a hangover to the charity model. So if you look at what's there in legislation such as the Disability Act, the only thing a child is entitled to is an assessment of their needs. They're not actually entitled to any services and supports within our legislation. So again, parents having to fight and fight and fight to get this assessment of need, this piece of paper that says your child has all these needs, but there's absolutely no services guaranteed in law to meet that child's needs. So children languishing then on waiting lists for years and no state obligation to really intervene. So I guess to me that is the movement, isn't it, towards a more rights-based agenda, and we have to push that forward and together in solidarity.
Very quickly, I suppose, just to go back to Stephen's question, and not just because we're guests of Children's Rights Alliance, but I'd probably ask them, because I mean they have made child poverty a political priority in a way that, like with a small team, it has been firmly put on the agenda. Obviously, we're awaiting delivery from the child poverty unit, but the fact that it's positioned in the department of the Taoiseach is, I suppose, a really important thing, to go back to a point that Seamus was making earlier. And I think a mistake that civil society organisations often make is to give up on a campaign after 2 years of things not working. Persistence is, I suppose, absolutely critical. You know how long it takes to create change, and to give up on a campaign after 18 months or 2 years is often something that you see happen, but it's about building in, I suppose, a level of agility, adapting to the broader political and economic environment and positioning it within that respect. And I suppose I spoke about organising and probably sound like an old trade union head when I said it, but what I meant was, like, a lot of the organisations here do have a presence in communities, and it's really hard, I think to get that message across in a poverty context, because there remains obviously a stigma around that, to have people talking about their own experience of poverty, but ensuring that local TDs are hearing that message. Often in the sector we focus on, because of scant resources, we focus our efforts on Oireachtas committees on particular ministers, but ensuring that those ministers are hearing messages from their backbenchers, from local TDs, is equally as important as doing the work with having the meeting with the minister once a year. It's about them hearing that constantly through PQs, through their constituency colleagues, and ensuring that there is momentum towards it. And that unfortunately costs money and effort and time, but when it can be done, and I think Children's Rights Alliance might be able to give us a case study on it, they've also provided the evidence basis behind it constantly for years, as well as developing those close relationships with government departments and officials at various levels within those departments. And I think that, I suppose, in terms of practical measures, are incredibly important. And I don't know if Julie or Tanya or anyone here wants to give an answer to that could give a roadmap as to where they got with the child poverty unit in the department.
Very important point there. You touched on, and everybody has touched on, reports or the use of evidence in policy making, whether that's the cost of disability report or various reports on where poverty rates are higher. And I suppose this feeds into kind of evidence and how that's used by policymakers. Do you think there has been a shift? I suppose Naomi mentioned the QCI being higher for older children, and that was very much based on the Vincentian MESL research, which showed the costs are greater. But do you think there's more of a road to go in relation to that, or how can evidence be used more, or should we concentrate on campaigning and using the political system to kind of get change? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Seamus, do you want to go in there?
Yeah, I think reports are important. They have to be done. And I look forward to Sarah's report coming shortly. And I know there are other reports and I think the failure, I think, is we don't use them enough. We're often told, oh, look, the poverty industry. Remember Charlie McCreevy called a few of us pinko lefties one time. So we went in the next day to the meeting wearing pink badges just to prove that we were delighted with the compliment. But the point we're making is the community voluntary pillar, which you and all of these organisations are part of, are committed to evidence-based. We don't go campaigning unless we use evidence. The evidence is there. I don't think we shout it enough, and I think we have to keep doing it. But I think the campaigns are essential, because nothing is heard until you make the campaign. And I think it's great. This event is a great tribute to the Children's Rights Alliance and the organisations supporting it. More of these events have to happen, but let's be clear, evidence-based only, and that needs research, it needs reports, and keep them coming.
Yeah, we often say at Inclusion Ireland, we're looking forward to a time when people don't have to tell their sad stories publicly to get political attention, and that the data speaks for itself. But unfortunately, right now, there does need to be a balance between the data, which is incredibly important, that all of our campaign work is based on that and facts-based campaigns, and also the telling of stories, because I think hearts and minds need to be opened, hearts and minds need to be won, but we look forward to a time when that's not a necessity.
Yep.
I was just going to point out to something. Tricia and I were both at a recent meeting with the Department of Social Protection officials, and we were questioning why the budget was not child friendly last year, when we knew that children were the group most likely to live in poverty. And I think, well, it's brilliant that we have all these evidence, and we use that evidence all the time in our advocacy work and our policy work and our submissions to the government. But what we were told at the time was, yes, at the end of the day, political decisions around budget are evidence informed, not evidence based. So I think our budgets are politically proofed, not poverty proofed. And until we, put poverty into that agenda, we're always going to have that same result.
Thanks. And just on that, you mentioned the Low Pay Commission earlier, Paul. I suppose that has been quite successful in taking some of the politics out around decisions around the national minimum wage. Do you think a similar, social welfare commission could achieve the same in relation to budget time, and how we use evidence, or would that be something that could be effective?
I think so. It would probably depend on the makeup of it, but I mean, the Low Pay Commission in and of itself, whatever problems we might have with recommendations that they make, it is a successful model in terms of taking the politics out of low pay, bringing together obviously industry, obviously employers and representatives of workers and employees. I think was an important step, and ultimately it's a model that we do see probably harks back to social partnership in a sense, but if we're talking about the Scandinavian countries, what they tend to do well in some senses is moderation. It's taking the politics out of those big decisions, getting the various stakeholders around the table, and that ultimately will always lead to a degree of compromise, but it does ensure that there is an evidence-informed body that is in place, and I think it would be a positive thing, yeah.
So, yeah, Julie?
I don't normally need a microphone, but I think all the people online might need to hear it. I have one question for every panel member, and it's, what is the one thing you would like to see in Budget 24?
Does anyone want to go first so I can think about it?
An increase in the qualified child rate is essential if we're going to leave those children who are poorest in it. But linking that to also universal payment, I'm taking your words, but I'm also going to say for children in direct provision to get child benefit. Yeah. Do you want to, or do you want to say what?
Yes, exactly that. Either an increase in the DEA is needed, or the true universalization of child benefit to support asylum-seeking children as well.
Back to me. So I suppose a significant investment in youth work. Obviously, Seamus mentioned at the start how it can really impact communities when services are removed. And while the purpose of youth work isn't to necessarily prevent poverty, it's to give young people a place for their own personal development. It is something that, if it is invested in properly, gives young people the skills to live more fulfilling and I suppose successful lives, and there's many different ways in which that manifests, but it's a budget that is entirely reliant on one department. It's quite a small budget, but with the will and with the investment in infrastructure as well as young people and staff and volunteers could really provide a boost and be a preventive measure for many issues around poverty as well.
Julie, I'll have words with you after about that question. But when everything is important, how do you pin it down to one thing? But I guess if I was to pin it to one thing, I'd say a permanent cost of disability payment and a recognition of the enduring requirement that some disabled children have in Ireland to that payment. Thank you.
I'm trying, Julie, to be clever a little bit. You asked for one, so would I get away with 1A, 1B, 1C? Obviously, look, the 1A is make the minimum essential standard living real. Without that, nothing else works. The B, you've heard me already saying it, apply the universal education system available in DESH, apply it universally, and drop the 3.5 kilometre limit to schools.
I'm very impressed by that, everybody. Well, Seamus give you a pass, but everybody managed to stick to one. We had a question over here, yeah?
Hi, Roisin Webb. I formerly worked with the government. I don't anymore, but I've worked in the sector for a very long time. I just want to thank the Children's Rights Alliance for a brilliant campaign. And I suppose I just really want to thank all of the advocates in the room and the people who are working on the ground, because I've come from the NGO sector / working as a lawyer, gone into the Ombudsman for Children's Office and into government. And I suppose I've just seen a massive improvement in advocacy and I had a question, Seamus answered it already, around what countries do well. And I was then going to ask about the rights-based approach. Dervla, you addressed it so beautifully. I mean, these things weren't happening in the sector 20 years ago. They just weren't. So I just want to commend everyone in the room. And I suppose it gives me massive hope to hear how professional everybody's campaigns are, how persistent they are, and how joined up the advocacy is in the sector. So a huge well done to everybody that's here. I suppose I had the question around, is there a difference as Hugh pointed out, the countries that are doing well, and Seamus followed on with other examples, Estonia, but the Scandinavian countries. I mean, I think politics is so reactive, you know, and I think there is a huge challenge in that lens of changing things from a charitable model to a rights-based model. And I think that's the massive challenge that maybe hasn't fed through to government, even though it is so professionally articulated across the sector now. So, you know, when it comes to reactivity, Seamus, that issue you pointed out is so close to my own heart because I've worked in youth justice in government. And, you know, to see the reaction of, you know, my own minister, I've just left justice a year ago, immediately reacting to the issue around violence in the streets or increased crime, whatever. It's not really increasing, it's just the lens around it has changed maybe with Extra Gardaí, when, you know, the reality is there is no Irish Youth Justice Service anymore. That's kind of just been dissolved and nobody has really noticed. I've noticed because I've been involved in government as that happened. But, you know, I suppose it's just to say to everybody in the sector, keep up that sustained approach. And one thing I would just watch out for is that government has also become really professional at adopting the rights-based language. So one thing that I took away from yesterday's discussion was what Fintan O'Toole said about implementation and accountability. And I've worked on loads of strategies as a government employee where I've had to fill in a form and Bob F for Irish Youth Justice Strategy and how well we've done. But I've also worked on the other side of the fence. So I'd be screaming inside saying, we have not done this. That answer doesn't answer that. But that's how it works. So if you let government off the hook with another strategy that has a vague outcome, that allows politicians to just write their PQs. You know, people in government who really do care and who really want to make a difference, it allows it to be politicised in a way that is not fair and does not reflect what's happening on the ground. So what I would say to people, having been that soldier that is frustrated, is don't give up on challenging and asking to be consulted at the very beginning of policy development. And one thing I would say to everyone in the room on that is that Section 7 of the Ombudsman for Children's Office, where I have worked, is completely underutilised. And that is the section that requires, it's a really good act and a really good piece of legislation, but it's not used enough. It requires government to consult with the Ombudsman for Children around laws and policies that affect children. And it's very powerful, and it is a requirement of legislation. And I can tell everybody in this room, and I've worked in legislation and policy, it does not happen. So that is something that you definitely could focus on as a joint campaign within the sector. And I think pushing for that change in that lens to rights-based. I mean, you know, maybe the countries that do it better don't have a dualist system where international human rights law are just considered kind of soft law. But, you know, I also have worked on a piece of legislation where I had to fight really hard for the best interests of the child in the Children Act, actually, just a small amendment to the Children Act. But it was interesting as a government official to see how, even now, with everything we know about best interests, how basic it is as part of our constitution, it was a big fight to get that in. So do not underestimate the challenge before you, but I think I'm so hopeful listening to everybody today, so well done, and thank you.
Thanks so much. Does anybody want to come back in on that, or just to say thank you? Okay. Oh, yes, we have one more, and this might be the last one. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Sorry, I need the glasses. I have a question, but I need to set the scene. My name is Sharon, and I avail of targeted support in Back to Education for Mature Students. So I did my dissertation on early school, even in DASH schools. So this kind of covers across a few things I've been today. So as discussed, for somebody who ages out over 18, child benefit goes entirely if they're in school. I've somebody that's recently left school and I was a single parent. So with the ECCE schemes and with transition year, most people are 19 or nearing 19. So there's a gap there. For over 16 early school leavers, there's nothing in the children's allowance if they've left school. And they're over the legal age for leaving school. So there is no engagement from school completion officers and the supports that are there when everybody's kind of fighting to try and keep somebody there till 16. That's a basic, that's not really engagement. So when we add that into the lower rate of welfare under 25, when their peers are beginning to thrive, we then have people who have left school early being referred to the likes of the CTECs or whoever in this world who are carrying out services on behalf of Department of Social Protection. When I was doing my research last year, came across young people who are being exploited by some employers offering apprenticeships where they're not been let go on the apprenticeships. I believe that's beginning to, start taking place this year. So this is for people who have been in DEIS schools and they were secondary school people who had left in over the last 10 years. Most of those people who I interviewed had not been at a primary DEIS school. So my question to the panel, and I just wanted to say I wouldn't have got ethical approval to include vulnerable groups like travellers and Roma and people with disability and asylum seekers. So bear in mind that this doesn't really include them specifically. But would the panel support an increase in the legal age for school leaving to reflect the reality of now? And do they think that would help? Because that would actually be a policy as opposed to the ad hoc supports.
Thank you. I certainly know the loss of child benefit is a massive issue we see for SVP across the country, but I don't know if anyone has a particular view on that yet. Louise?
I think the point you raise about child benefit is really, really valid. And it also goes down to intergenerational poverty as well, because children who, as you said, a lot of children are starting sixth year at age 18, when parents who are struggling financially, they lose their child benefit. But they don't, and the child, if they're dependent on social welfare, so that's people with a disability, a lone parent or carers, all of these people who have children who may not be able to access employment, and they're really relying on the child benefit. Sixth year is one of the most expensive year going into school. All of those extra demands, they lose child benefit because they're now an adult, but they're not entitled to the adult qualified rate. They're still entitled to the child qualified rate, and that makes a huge disadvantage for those children. And anecdotally, and I'd love to see some research on it, but anecdotally I know where parents are really struggling, and there's so much work done in, to get children into the higher education access route for disadvantaged children, but they're not looking at that 1 year where there's a real difference, where children are going into secondary school for the last year and don't have child benefit, and there's real poverty. And anecdotally is what I was going to say is, I have heard cases where parents are forced to encourage their child to leave sixth year to take up a youth reach program so they can access their own social welfare payment. That is a prime example of what we're doing to enhance intergenerational poverty, whereas we will give them the support when they get into third level education, but we're not allowing them to get to that level. And that would be really important, to have that child benefit for that last year until children finish second level school. The issue about whether the school age should be increased, again, I'd be very mindful of putting pressure on parents who are in an area where a 17-year-old won't go into school, and that there's a punitive follow on for those children or for the parents of those children. So I'd be concerned about that, but I would be interested in looking at research. But I think supporting children fully to complete second level education is crucial if we want to break intergenerational poverty.
Thanks, Louise. I think you raise important questions, and we've got a good opportunity to chat over lunch as well. So we're close to, we're actually over time. So I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank our panel. Luckily, Julie asked the last question I had in mind, so we're good to go. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to our keynote speaker, Hugh Fraser. Also, thank you to the Children's Rights Alliance team who've been doing Trojan work this week and in the lead up to it. I think the momentum we've seen around the issue of child poverty is something I haven't seen before since my time at SVP. I'm feeling really hopeful. And I think it's really important. There's a couple of weeks to go. There's still decisions to be made, and it's really important that we claim our space for children in this budget so that we have a really focused children's budget. So thank you, and I'll bring it to a close. And thank you very much for your discussion today.